I destroyed a Tyranid in a previous build and was left with something most people would throw away. All that remained was a broken torso with no top, no bottom, and almost no extra parts to fix it. I still decided to turn into a creature designed to hunt Dreadnoughts, and the only way this build works is if the base solves the problem. The idea was to make it into an ambush predator that is emerging from underground. So the first thing I did was design a base for my Tyranid that would make it roughly the same height as a Dreadnought. As I didn't know the dimensions of the miniature itself, I used the build plate on top of my screen to give me a 1-to-1 perspective of what it's gonna look like once it's finally printed out. This worked better than I expected, as when I placed the miniature inside the base, it was exactly what I was hoping for. Next, I needed to remove some of the extra parts that got left over because when I was originally cutting this thing apart, I really didn't expect to use this part again. I ended up grinding much bigger holes than I technically needed, and this is because I'm not exactly sure about the position of the arms on the body itself, so I wanted to give myself a bit of extra room, especially for these absolutely massive digging claws. Handling this thing, I did clean up a few of the jagged edges, but I noticed that some of the previous neck was still present on the actual body itself. So I have to grind this thing down and try to make sure there's absolutely nothing left and expand the hole in such a way that I can place the head inside of it. It seems like a better idea, and structurally, it just made a lot more sense. Once the neck was done, I considered doing something with the bottom section, but I noticed that I left such a massive gash when I originally cut this thing apart that the only solution was to bury it. Now, to attach the Tyranid to the base, I was going to use a bit of milliput, but as I've had mine open for quite some time, it is a little bit dry, so I had to use a bit of water to try to soften it up, which made such a massive mess that I ended up not being able to actually record any of it, so here's a high-budget recreation of the event. Which is exactly how I ended up with this thing. Buried just deep enough to hold this thing and also hide that massive gash. It makes it look like the creature is still crawling out of the ground, so most of it is still below the surface. Next, as every true predator needs an absolutely horrifying looking head, I wanted to make something a little bit special. It's an idea I had for my Tau Tyranid, but I didn't get to use it as this head was simply far too big for that project. But here, this thing was absolutely perfect. Then I used a little bit of sprue glue to glue the head onto the body, because a common problem I run into is that when I begin sculpting stuff, if it's not connected, you end up moving it about quite a bit, especially when you're trying to put in some of the finer details. This way, I addressed most of the gaps and I can focus on sculpting the neck itself. Now, my plan was to fill in some of these massive side gaps, however, I had a different idea. Instead of filling them in, I'll create something that's much more interesting. As I've had these sides for years and I never found a use for them, I decided to borrow their thumbs and turn them into the side pincers. To sculpt the transition for them and also the rest of the neck, I used the Tamiya putty. At first, mixing such a large amount seemed like a bit of a waste. However, the more I addressed the gaps, the more I realized that I had a lot of filling that I needed to do. Pleasantly enough, filling in the side gaps was much simpler than I thought, but the challenge that snuck up at me out of nowhere is that I have to try and match the size of the neck to the size of the body. My initial idea was to simply attach the neck and fill in the gap with a putty, but sculpting a larger neck will just give it an overall coherent appearance and make it feel like it's part of the miniature rather than a head that was taped onto it. Additionally, it just made a lot more sense that a creature that burrows underground will have a much thicker neck, which is a pattern that you can notice in nature whenever you look at creatures like moles or wombats, or even the mighty beaver. Naturally, after expanding so much of the neck, it only made sense to make the shoulders just a little bit broader. This was also quite helpful in trying to reposition the arms in such a way that it appears like the left claw is pulling this creature out of the ground. When the putty got hard enough that it actually broke out of my sculpting pieces, I took it as a sign that it's time to finish up and finish my base. Using putty here instead of super glue might seem strange, but it's because the milliput is still wet, so I wasn't able to use super glue. Now, the final detail that I really considered was attaching a flying Tyranid so it appears as if it's flying over the battlefield and essentially scouting for this creature. But this truly felt like my ambition was trying to take over my common sense, so I decided against it, as attaching it would probably just damage the Tyranid in the process. Now, while I am only using extra bits of this project, if you are looking for new miniatures, check out miniswap.gg, who are sponsoring today's video. It's a website for buying and selling miniatures that was designed by fellow hobbyists. For example, when you're buying an item, you actually get to see exactly what was the retail price of it, so you know what kind of deal you're getting. For example, I managed to find this Chaos Space Marine that's been sold out for quite some time now, and is usually being sold at like twice the price. However, I managed to find it right here at literal retail value. It also verifies everybody selling on the website and has some additional additional protections so that when you're buying it, you have some peace of mind behind it. And your first order also has free shipping. Now, if your pile of shame is getting a little bit too big and you want to sell something, the selling process is also streamlined. So you just gotta type in the name of the box you want to sell, and it'll fill in all of the details for you. Additionally, the shipping and all of that is automatic, so you just gotta print out the label and ship out the item, the rest is handled for you. Not to mention they have some of the lowest seller fees compared to other competitors, which charge much more. So if you're looking to buy some miniatures, make sure to check out mediswap.gg. Now, if you're looking to sell some of your miniatures, make sure to use the link below as you'll get 0 seller fees for the first 3 months. Back to the video. Choosing a color scheme for this monstrosity was a little bit of a no-brainer. As I borrowed the head from my Tau Tyranid, it only made sense to borrow the color scheme as well. Nicknamed the Red Tide, the Tau have no idea about the origin of that Tyranid, let alone that that force was simply the first scouting party of the bigger Hive fleet that is heading towards them. But before it gets there, I imagined this creature on a green luscious planet, so I painted the base to match that idea. When I was sculpting the neck and the arms, I avoided getting any of the putty onto the carapace, with the exception of the first plate of that massive shell. Seeing them both painted up showed that sacrificing that plate was worth it. Painting the arm tendons, I noticed that I might have gone a little bit too hard when highlighting the skin, so I used my favorite acrylic wash over the entire area. Now, I would have done that regardless to bring some more definition into it, but I mixed up a much heavier version of it so that the staining effect is much more pronounced. Not wanting to wait for all this wash to dry, I chose to leave it overnight, but something kept bothering me. Now, despite me thinking that a green luscious base would be a perfect match for a red Tyranid, honestly, it didn't really work, so I decided to repaint the entire thing and take this base in an entirely different direction. At first, I thought I covered up with black paint, but I noticed that it had a bit of a cold hue to it. And it's that slight difference in tone that gave me the idea to turn this into a massive rock. I used the mighty sponge as essentially a massive dry brush and allowed it to do most of the work. Then to create a sense of weathering and dust, I used a bit of dry pigment over the entire area and gave it these very bright alien tufts that, despite their name, exist in real life as something called flame grass. Like a phoenix that has risen from the ashes, the green color is back, this time on the Tyranid claws. The more time I spent looking at this massive creature, the more I just really enjoyed the transition between the red and the black, so I thought I'll give my digging claws a bit of that cool carapace. Next up, I wanted to take a little bit of extra time and give this thing a really nice pair of teeth that'd be much brighter than the rest of it. Coincidentally, this is also something I noticed when I was painting the Tau Tyranid, is that despite this being such a small part of the model, you actually end up spending a lot of time looking at them and they just somehow draw your eye towards them. Despite the overall retro color scheme, I still wanted to include a little bit of OSL, and the window to the nothing of this monstrosity felt like the perfect place. But those eyes also made me realize that I really need to step up the rest of the paint job, and taking these claws to an absolutely toxically horrifying looking green felt like the best place to start. But this also turned into a hilarious game of whack-a-mole, as with every bright new feature, all the other ones became far too dim and unnoticeable, so I had to bring them up in brightness. But for the carapace itself, I decided to go in a slightly different direction and make it look a little bit more ashy. That's with an H. As I always imagined carapace being this semi-porous material, it made sense that grinding through all of that rock while this creature was crawling underground would have generated a bunch of dust that would have settled on top of it. As the color scheme went through so much transformation of shades, brightnesses, and saturations, I also thought it'd be quite appropriate to do something different with the skin, by going in a much warmer tone and taking the skin from a wine red to now a much more brighter orange, because perhaps the atmosphere of this planet creates an orange tint. With so many bright and saturated colors, the one place I felt comfortable desaturating was the smoke coming from the back. And with that, my Tyranid Dreadnought Hunter was ready. All that was left to do was battle his rival.